Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. We will get started in just a few minutes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining today. My name is Vanessa, and I'm a qualitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions. And today, this webinar will be focused on mastering your qualitative methodology. So this webinar is specifically geared towards doctoral students who are in the process of writing the methods chapter for their dissertation. And particularly if you are thinking about doing a study that is using a qualitative methods, this is going to be helpful to you. We also have webinars dedicated to quantitative methods. So if you're kind of on the fence regarding the research tradition that you're going to use, we do have some different resources on our website that may help you in making that decision. So with regard to the structure of the qualitative methods chapter, it typically involves each of these components here that I've listed on the screen. So there's typically an introduction, a section dedicated to the research design and the justification or rationale for selecting that research design, the role of the researcher, the methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and then the summary. So today I will go through each of these components and talk about what considerations you should make as you are writing each of these sections. But as you're thinking through this, always refer back to any resources from your school, whether that is a template or a checklist or even sample dissertations, to ensure that you are aware of the specific requirements from your school. So some schools may have an extra section, or they may require sections that I'm going to present today in different areas. So although this list is very comprehensive and it's what we've seen most commonly, I just recommend checking in with your school to make sure that you've got all of your ducks in a row and you know exactly what it is that you need to be presenting. Before I get started on the content today, I'm just curious if you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and let me know where you are in your dissertation process. Are you just starting to write? Are you still thinking about what type of study you want to do? Drop some messages in the chat to give me an idea of where we all are to better guide the presentation today. All right, I see Victoria is collecting data. Good morning, Rachel. Hello. Okay, very good. We've got some writing done. Welcome, Shawnee. Hi, Dennis. Okay. All right, I see. Coding. Okay, some proposal stage, outline. All right, so we've got a big variety here today. It sounds like a good amount of people are in their writing process. Some are kind of getting ready to gear up for that writing. So I'll do my best to cover the gamut here. But if you do have questions, we'll open it up for question and answer at the end. And I'll do my best to answer all those questions. And then, of course, our contact information will be available as well if you want to reach out for some more one-on-one discussion. All right, keep popping those messages in the chat and I will continue here. So you will start the methodology chapter in the same way that you'll start pretty much every chapter in the dissertation. You will start with a brief introduction. In this introduction, you have two objectives. So the first is to reorient the reader to your study. And then the second objective is to give them a preview of what's going to be coming up in this chapter. So remember that by the time they've gotten to chapter 3, they've already read through your introduction and your literature search, or it could be maybe they're skipping around and they're just starting on your chapter 3, your reviewers. So in this introduction, you want to be sure to include a very comprehensive description of the purpose of your study, and also restating the questions that are guiding your study. With regard to your purpose and your questions, I recommend that you restate both of these verbatim here. This is going to ensure that the message that you're conveying across all of your chapters is consistent. We want to make sure that as your reviewers or anybody reading your paper is going from chapter to chapter, they aren't questioning what the study is for. So try to avoid changes in language. Although they may be minimal, they can really alter the meaning of the purpose statement. So for example, if the purpose of your study is to understand the perceptions of teachers who were delivering instruction during COVID-19. If you change that phrasing a little bit to maybe understanding the feelings or understanding the thoughts, it may lend itself to some ambiguity. So just try to be consistent in the way that you are describing your study throughout your paper. Once you have reoriented to the purpose, the questions, really the why of your study, you will move on to just previewing the chapter. So that can be as simple as providing a list in a narrative format of the different sections that you will be discussing in this chapter. So you may say, in this chapter, the researcher will present the procedures for data collection, participant recruitment, and data analysis. So just kind of previewing some of those bullet points that I shared on the component slide just before to let them know what to expect here. Next, you are going to talk about your research design. So here is where your knowledge about qualitative research methods is really going to come into play. And we will go through some of the big 5 qualitative designs. But here's where you're going to show that you know what each design is for, and you've critically thought about how the design relates to your study. So your selection of your research design should be rooted in your research questions and your purpose. And we'll get into that more in just a bit. But here you want to, again, restate those research questions, identify and define the phenomenon, the case, or the concept that you're studying. So if you're doing a phenomenological study, there's most likely a shared phenomenon that you are hoping to uncover some information on. So for example, the experience of teachers shifting to remote learning during COVID-19, that may be the phenomenon under study. So here you would identify and define what that means for your study. Now, if you're doing a case study design, rather than describing a phenomenon, you're going to be describing the case. So going along with that example, maybe I'm doing a case study of teachers delivering remote instruction. And maybe for the purposes of my study, a case is the school district in my local area. So that is the kind of uniting thread between each of the people that I'm interviewing and all of the data I'm collecting is that they're all from the same school district. I will talk a little bit more about defining your case, but that's kind of how it goes. You want to just identify what is it that unites everything that you're studying or all the data that you're collecting in that case study. And then same thing with the concept. So maybe rather than looking at a particular phenomenon like teaching during COVID-19, you want to understand best practices for bedside manner in the hospital. You want to understand nurses' perceptions on these practices. So in that case, you would be studying that concept of bedside manner and what practices or strategies are most appropriate. So kind of just thinking about the type of study that you're doing, and based on the purpose and based on the research questions, what definitions or what explanation does the researcher need? Does the reader need in order to move forward and understand how you're going to be measuring this phenomenon, case, or concept, and then looking more into the future, how are they going to be interpreting your results? So here's where you're going to provide that really clear and crisp definition so that they can move forward with a better understanding of your study. Next, you'll identify the tradition. So whether that is qualitative or quantitative. Today, again, I'm going to be talking about qualitative methods, but just to provide a refresher, qualitative methods deal with data that is textual in nature. When you're doing a qualitative study, it's generally because you want to understand the perceptions, feelings, study a phenomenon. So all of these things that are a little bit more difficult to do quantitatively. So the data that you're collecting is going to be through interviews, focus groups, really anything where you are talking to people, or maybe document reviews, observations, things like that. Whereas a quantitative study is used to really quantify or measure specific variables. So in a quantitative study, you may be administering a survey or a scale type of instrument. So if you are looking to measure perceptions, thoughts, feelings, then a qualitative study is most likely going to be best for you, or potentially a mixed methods, depending on what you're wanting to do. But here you're going to identify that tradition. So you're going to tell the reader what type you're doing, qualitative or quantitative. And you are also going to explain and provide a justification for why that method is most appropriate for your study. So to do that, you may want to explain some of the hallmarks of a qualitative study, which are some of the things that I just mentioned a minute ago. and really align those hallmarks with your study. So because I am interested in understanding the phenomenon of transferring to remote learning during COVID-19 from the perspective of teachers, a qualitative study is going to give me the opportunity to collect rich data and really get those experiences firsthand from teachers. You will do the same thing for your research design. So again, we're going to talk about the different research designs, but here you'll want to demonstrate that you understand what are the key features of the research design that you've selected, and how those key features align with your study. So we will continue to talk about research designs as we go on here. So here's just another refresher on why you should use a qualitative design. So if you're unsure, here are a few reasons that a qualitative design would make the most sense for you. So as I said, it's good for use with textual data. The nature of qualitative research requires you to read the transcripts, read the focus groups, and go through a systemic process of identifying codes and themes within that data. That is not something that you can do quantitatively, because quantitative research is more for the numerical data. So if you are going to be collecting textual data, qualitative is most likely going to be a good option for you. This is also good with helping to understand those perspectives and experiences. Again, that's because you are collecting that textual data, you're getting all of that information, and really getting to provide a more in-depth view of whatever it is that you're studying than if you were just administering a survey where participants had to maybe answer on a scale of 1 to 10. We're really getting to get behind those numbers and understand, well, what does a rating of 10 satisfaction mean? Tell me why you're satisfied with your experience doing XYZ. So we're really getting behind those numbers. Again, the data collection methods that you would use for a qualitative study include interviews, focus groups, documents, and observations. So here, rather than administering instruments and just kind of collecting that data, you're really engaging with your participants in a different way from if you were doing a quantitative study. You may be sitting across them face-to-face, talking to them, whether that's in person or on Zoom. You may be working with them over extended periods of time to gain exposure in the field. So the nature of this is a more intimate relationship with the data, because you are kind of speaking to them and collecting it in that way. Because of that nature, qualitative studies are typically done with smaller sample sizes. So when we think of quantitative, we want to generalize our findings to the population and have that large sample size. Here in the qualitative study, you most likely will not be able to interview 300 people for your dissertation, right? So your sample size may be anywhere from 6 to 20. So since we have a smaller sample size, the goal here is not to say, oh, because the teachers in my study had this experience, then all teachers have that experience. Here, the goal is to really just understand the experience of those participants in your study. And that can potentially be formative work for policy development, intervention development, based on what you've uncovered through those participants. Here, you're not going to do any hypothesis testing, so there's no statistical analysis involved in qualitative studies. Again, that's just because of the nature of the data that we're collecting. And through that, there's no need to quantify the results. So you won't be reviewing your results and saying, oh, 4 participants said they had a good experience transitioning to remote learning. And because there were 4, this is a significant finding. We're not really attributing significance or any type of judgment, value judgments on the results. Rather, we're just reporting what they are and contextualizing them in the field of literature. So we're going to explain what the participants said, and then
refer to the literature that's been conducted to conclude whether or not your findings are in line with previous literature or if you are finding something new or different. So the qualitative research designs that I will review today are case study, phenomenology, generic qualitative, grounded theory, and ethnography. These are, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just 5 research designs that we commonly see students using. But again, there are others, so do not feel limited if you feel like your research question or your study does not line up with the ones that we're talking about today. So a case study design is a really good method when you are wanting to look at something from multiple different angles. In this type of research design, you are typically collecting multiple forms of data. So you may be doing qualitative interviews. You may also collect a document review or participant observations. And the goal there is really to drill down on this topic and understand it from all of these different perspectives. So when you are conducting a case study, there should be a bounding feature or a uniting factor among your cases. So for example, if I want to understand the experiences of women who gave birth in Florida, I could define my case as the Florida hospital system and then interview different women who have given birth in Florida. You can also define your case a little bit differently. So in one study that we did, we were looking at the experience of individuals who survived through a hurricane. And so one way that we defined the case study was to just look at people who experienced Hurricane Andrew. So the case was Hurricane Andrew. In a separate study, we looked at just individuals who had experienced a hurricane. And so we looked at people who had experienced Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Irene. So you can see how you can kind of zoom in and zoom out to define your case study or to define your case. And it really depends on the researcher what is most appropriate and really what you're looking to understand. But you kind of have that flexibility there to drill down to kind of the unit level or to back up and look from a bird's eye view to develop the case. So the goal of this is to generate a rich description of the case or the cases that are involved in your study. And then you will examine any emerging themes of your data, just as you would with other qualitative studies. The next one, phenomenology. I think this is one that I see most commonly with dissertations. This is used when you're wanting to understand the lived experience of participants and really get to the essence of what that experience is. So here you are collecting maybe interviews from 10 to 12 people, and you want to understand what the shared experience is or how they make meaning of the shared experience across all of them. So for example, one phenomenological study that I worked on was to understand the experiences of Black women who had endometrial cancer. So the goal in this study was not necessarily to describe the different experiences among each participant, but was really to identify what are they saying that's the same? Are there any shared features in this phenomenon that all of these women are experiencing? Now, that's not to say that you don't report outliers. Outliers are a really important part of qualitative research because it's showing that people are not all the same, right? And it's kind of providing rigor to your study by being, some disconfirming evidence where you're saying, okay, 5 participants said X, but we did have a sixth participant who said why. So that is an important feature, and you will include it in this type of study. But here, what you're looking for are those shared features. So among those women who had endometrial cancer, what did they say related to barriers to care? Are there any common barriers to care that they've observed? The way that you would collect data for this type of study, again, is in-depth interviews. So that can be anything from 60 minutes upwards to a few hours. It really just depends on the data that you're collecting and how long your interview guide is. But when you are putting that together, be sure to make some considerations about your participants' time and the quality of the data that you can collect over a longer period of time. So again, here the goal is to really highlight those commonalities. What are the shared experiences that these individuals have related to a specific phenomenon? Next, generic qualitative. This is a study that kind of combines the various features of the ones that we've talked about so far. So if you have research questions that aren't necessarily looking to discuss or identify a phenomenon, or they're not really looking to talk about a particular uniting factor or a case, then a generic qualitative study may be appropriate for what you're hoping to write your dissertation on. So in this study, rather than understanding how people are processing or making sense of their experiences, instead, we're really looking outward here. So we want to just know, what is the experience? So rather than understanding what are your perceptions related to the strategies to transfer to online learning during COVID, we just want to know, what were the strategies? Describe how your district handled COVID. So this is kind of that more plain, just identifying what those features are, as opposed to the that kind of meaning portion. This can be coupled very well with a mixed method study. So you may collect some quantitative data and then expand further on that exploration using a generic qualitative design. Because this is a more flexible type of research design, you have some room to move around with your data collection. So you can use interviews, questionnaires, surveys written, and you can also use observations as well. I always recommend this article here, Percy et al. 2015, for students who are kind of grappling with justifying the use of a generic qualitative study. Sometimes you may run into reviewers who think that this is not specific enough, or it's not as specialized, and so they may question the rigor of this study. But this Percy et al. Article does a really good job of providing an explanation for why the generic qualitative study kind of has its own right and is useful for specific cases. Now, the next two study designs that I talk about are a little bit more work intensive, and typically they require a little more knowledge of qualitative methods to execute. So the first is grounded theory. Grounded theory is different from the research that we're all typically used to. So most of us, we start with research questions and a hypothesis, and then we go on to collect data and analyze the data. A grounded theory study is different in that you are letting the data inform the development of the theory for your research. So the data is informing your hypothesis. In this type of study, the goal is to generate a theory. So a common example that most people are familiar with is the stages of grief. The stages of grief were created using a grounded theory study, where researchers were interviewing people and trying to understand, what do you go through when you are in the process of grieving? And through that, they found these common stages and developed the theory of, these grief stages. So that is the process for a grounded theory study. This should only be used when there is not a lot of research or not a lot of literature on a particular topic. So maybe there is a process that has been understudied. For example, the theory of the process to commit a crime. That's something that's very well studied. You need to have motive, opportunity, and these different features. But there may be things out there in your fields or things that you're exploring that you feel that there is not a clear conceptual model or theory to explain that particular phenomenon or process or activity. So if that is true for you, then this may be a good option. This can also be used when there is a theory, but maybe that theory was developed for a different population than what you want to study. So for example, we have the stages of grief, but is there a theory about stages of grief for particular types of losses? It may be appropriate to do further exploration, looking at maybe people who are grieving a loss due to a chronic illness, or people who are grieving due to the loss of a child. There may be opportunities to explore those particular avenues if that process is different, or maybe just to understand if that process is different, right? Do these people have a different experience? Who were the initial data collected from to develop that first theory of grief? So if there's no theory, this is a good option, or if there's a theory that may not be applicable for the population or sample that you want to study, grounded theory may work for you. The reason that I say that this is a little bit more work intensive is because the coding and analysis process is very different from the previous studies. So in this type of study, you will collect your data, and then you will begin to analyze your data through open, axial, and selective coding. And then once you've done that, you will go back and collect more data and kind of follow this cyclical process until you've reached theoretical saturation. So the hallmark of a grounded theory study is that you are continuing to add information to your theory until you find that there's nothing new emerging here. So you're kind of going through the cyclical process rather than just collecting data from 6 participants or this predetermined amount of participants before moving forward. So this, because of this nature, this takes a little bit longer. So it may be challenging to do within the scope of a doctoral dissertation, but people do it. So again, it just relates back to the purpose of your study and what it is that you're wanting to understand through your paper. Ethnography is another one that's a little bit more work intensive. The purpose of an ethnographic study is to understand a problem in a cultural or societal context. So for example, maybe you want to understand the child rearing practices of a particular Native American tribe. Because you are looking at that phenomenon through this cultural lens, this study would be an ethnography. Now you can rationalize it as a case study or as another type of study, but truly, if you are looking through that lens, it really fits best in this camp. Now, when I say cultural or societal context, I think it's really important to mention that that is not specific to race or ethnicity. This can be related to different types of subcultures. So there's been really Sorry about that. It looks like I was disconnected for a minute there. But where I dropped off, I was saying that with ethnography, you can kind of push the limits here and really think outside of the box of how you are defining culture. It's not limited to a particular racial group or ethnic group. It can be individuals who kind of share a particular experience, like night shift workers or individuals who use substances or individuals who are part of a particular community. So you're really just trying to understand what their context is among that group. So you can kind of think outside of the box here. Now, this typically takes a longer time because it involves extended field work. So to really immerse yourself in that culture, it's not enough to just do interviews. You have to conduct observations, have conversations with participants, really be in the field or immerse yourself within that cultural context. So this one, again, is a little bit more work intensive for the scope of a doctoral paper, but it's a great opportunity if it aligns with your particular research questions. So that was a very long introduction or refresher on qualitative methods, but essentially that is what you'll be discussing in that methodology portion where you are identifying the design that you've used and providing some justification for why you've used it. Next, you will go on to talk about the participants who are included in your study. So remember here from your early stats classes, the population of the study is the individuals that your sample will be drawn from. And the sample is going to be the people that actually participate in your study. So earlier I said that I was interested in doing a study to identify teachers' experiences transitioning to remote teaching during COVID-19. So in that case, my population could be teachers at my local school district, and then the sample will be the individuals who actually participate. So I will probably have 6 to 10 teachers who I actually interview for the study. So in this section, you want to identify your population and your sample. You may provide some demographic characteristics of your population here, particularly if you're in the proposal phase and you haven't collected this data yet. You may say there are 2,000 teachers at my local school district. The average age among these teachers is 35. The demographic breakdown is XYZ, just to give an idea of who it is that you will be inviting to participate in this study. Next, you will talk about your sampling strategy. So how is it that you intend on selecting people to participate in your study? Typically, with a qualitative study, it's going to be through purposive sampling. So what that means is there's some type of predetermined criteria that people need to meet to be in the study. So for my study, I want to interview teachers. So I will intentionally seek out individuals who are teachers rather than kind of putting out a flyer on Facebook and inviting anybody to participate. So more likely than not, you'll be using purposive sampling for your particular study as well. You'll also discuss the inclusion and exclusion criteria here. So are there any factors that would exclude someone from being permitted to participate? So you kind of have to think through these characteristics. It's really dependent on your study. Common exclusion criteria are, or rather I would say inclusion criteria are, they must be over the age of 18, they must be willing to participate, they must provide informed consent, but you may have some other important considerations to make. So if you're doing a study where you want to understand maybe professional development opportunities at a particular organization, you might include inclusion criteria that says they have to have worked at this organization for 3 years. So it really just depends on your study and what makes the most sense. There's no right or wrong answer here, but you do want this inclusion and exclusion criteria to be very clear, because as you are recruiting participants, this is going to be, these are going to be the deciding factors that put them in the participation bin or in the thank you so much. But we, you know, you don't need to participate in this study type of camp. So make sure that this is clear and that you can justify it. So it should always have a reason for whatever the criteria or characteristic is. Next, you'll talk about the number of participants. So the number of participants that you use are going to be based on the particular research design that you've selected. Each research design has kind of foundational literature that discusses how many participants are needed to reach saturation. So saturation means that you have identified all of the emerging themes. So for example, if you only interview one person, yes, that is collecting qualitative data, but you may just be scratching the surface with that one person. You may need to get 6 more people before you start to see kind of repetitive information coming in through your data. So when deciding your sample size, I recommend just referring to the literature to see what has been done before for these studies, and then you can provide citations to that literature to provide your rationale for why the sample size is appropriate for your study. Here, you also want to include the steps that you're going to go through to identify, contact, and recruit your participants. This should be described in kind of like an instruction manual type format. You will have it in your narrative text, but you want it to be in a very step-by-step kind of recipe so that if somebody else wants to conduct this study, they can replicate what you've done. So that means that you will explain your IRB approval process. So you most likely need to get some type of institutional review board approval in order to go forward with your study. So you will start there. If you need to get any permissions from a site to recruit participants there. So if I wanted to collect data from a school, I may need to reach out to the principal and ask them for contact information for the teachers, or maybe I need to ask if they will distribute an email with information about my study, or if they will post a flyer in the staff room. So if there's any permission that you need in order to go forward with your data collection, that should be outlined here as well. And then once individuals become aware of your study, so if I were to send out a flyer, how are people going to get back in contact with me? It could be as simple as they can access the email address on the flyer to indicate their interest, or maybe one thing that I see very commonly is the use of QR codes. So maybe you include a QR code on a flyer that individuals can scan if they're interested. If you go that route, I recommend creating a brief screening survey. So they can scan the QR code, answer a few questions related to your inclusion or exclusion criteria, and then you on the back end can look at that survey, and based on the responses, you'll know if this person should be included or not, and you can reach back out to them. So this process is very specific to what resources you have available to you, the time that you have for your recruitment and data collection. But here you will just want to provide a very detailed description of what you're doing. And if you are unsure of what your recruitment process could be, of course, feel free to reach out and ask questions. But another good place to start is through just reading qualitative papers and seeing how others have recruited their participants. ProQuest is also a good resource that's kind of a database of dissertations. So you can see what other students have done to facilitate their recruitment as well. Next, you are going to talk about your methodology. So here you're going to specifically be talking about what instrument you use to collect your data. So typically with the qualitative study, it's going to be an interview protocol, a focus group protocol. Maybe if you're doing observations, you can include an observation sheet. So you'll want to talk about how you developed that instrument. So, how did you come up with your interview questions? Did you consult with experts in that field to identify, what points you should be hitting on? Did you use a particular theoretical framework to identify groups of questions or categories for questions that really informed the topics of those questions? So here you'll talk about the development of your instruments. You will also talk about, whether or not they are new or if they have been used. More often than not, I'm seeing that students are creating their own interview guides or focus group protocols, but that's not to say that there aren't ones out there that may be helpful or useful for your particular study, depending on what it is that you are exploring. If you're doing a document review, here you'll also want to talk about how you are identifying those documents. So if you are collecting maybe maybe you want to collect data on student performance as a result of the pandemic. So you're going to be collecting their samples of their writing or samples of their exams. Here you just want to explain how you are verifying the accuracy of that data. So what is the kind of chain through which you are getting it? Are you getting it directly from the teacher? Are students handing that in to you directly? You'll just describe that. If you're using publicly available data, so there was one study I worked on where they examined course syllabi and looked for specific characteristics within the syllabi. So in that case, we said that this data was publicly available through the course, the school website, and that's just showing the reader that that this is a verified source and it's appropriate to answer your research questions. And that kind of leads into this last bullet here. The main point of this instrumentation section is to explain that the questions that you're answering or the questions that you're asking or the data that you're collecting is appropriate and sufficient to answer the research questions that you've outlined in this study. Next, you will go more in depth in the steps to collect your data. So you've already talked about your recruitment process. Here you're going to be talking about the actual data collection process. So are you going to be collecting your data in person? Or are you going to be doing your interviews or focus groups via Zoom or another platform? What does that look like for your study? Here you'll talk about that. You'll also talk about who's going to collect the data. So you may be doing your interviews yourself. It could be that you have maybe an undergraduate research assistant or a graduate research assistant that you're going to have do your interviews. Whatever the case is, you'll describe that as well. And then you'll also talk about the frequency and duration of your data collection events. So if you are doing a study that requires more extensive field work, like an ethnographic study, you may be going into the field 2-3 times a month. Here you'll describe how often you go, how much time you spend with the participants when you go. And then if you're doing a study that is just collecting a one-time interview, you'll still describe the duration here to give the reader an idea of what your exposure was to the participants. Next, and this is so important in the methodology, and I think just in the process of conceptualizing your own workflow as the researcher, you want to talk about how the data is going to be recorded. So if you are collecting your data in person, what are you using to record the session? And then once it is recorded, how are you getting that data into written form? So how are you transcribing the data to prepare it for analysis? There are lots of different ways to do this. I don't think there's any right or wrong way. It again depends on the resources that you have available to you and your preference. For me, my preferred method to do this is I like to have Zoom up when I'm doing an interview, and I will use the Zoom record feature. whether that's in person or online. I just open up Zoom, record on Zoom. And then some people will use that Zoom transcription feature. And then others will take the recording and they will send it to a transcription company to have it transcribed. So again, just depends on what your preference is. Another way that I see students doing this is through Otter AI. That's another website that records and transcribes information. But it just really depends on your preference. Some people don't want to take the time or don't have the time to transcribe their own data by hand. So they use transcription companies, or they use, the Zoom option, which it will transcribe it for you. But regardless of what you do, just make sure that you are building in a spot checking process, because sometimes the recording will be picked up incorrectly. Technical words that you use may be misspelled or acronyms may be wrong. So just make sure you're spot checking. That way, when it gets time to analyze the data, you're not having to go back and listen to your recordings and kind of fix your transcripts at that point, because that can be very cumbersome. And then here you'll also talk about any contingency plans. So if you're not able to reach the sample size that you intended on, what is going to be your next step to get to that sample size? So that contingency plan can be as simple as to start your recruitment process again. This, it doesn't need to be a very new type of process. You can kind of just stick with your tried and true recruitment strategy, or maybe have a plan B recruitment strategy to keep pushing forward and ensuring that you're getting the data from all the participants that you need. Now, take into account when you are collecting data, specifically having to schedule interviews, it is not uncommon for people to cancel, be late, things happen. So kind of just go with the flow, stay following up with people, continue your recruitment efforts, and don't get bogged down by kind of slower data collection events or slower progress. Just keep moving forward and make sure to build in your timeline some cushion time. That way you're not rushing at the end or kind of scrambling to meet a deadline because you didn't give yourself enough time to collect your data. If you're going to be doing any follow-up procedures, so like member checking, you will also want to describe that here in this section. And then the last step is to talk about your data analysis plan. So for data analysis, for qualitative studies, there are a number of different softwares that you can use. Some that I see most commonly used are NVivo, Atlas TI, MaxQDA, Deduce. I've even seen students use Excel. And the benefit to using a software is that it can organize all of your files, and it'll give you the opportunity to search across files for different codes or themes. Now, it does not really take the work out of it. So regardless of what you are doing for a qualitative study, you're going to have to read through your interviews probably multiple times and really go through and identify those key features in each interview. But the software may be helpful. It has features like text search and really gives a good bird's eye view of all of the data together. But people also code by hand. So you may print out all of your interviews, get some colorful highlighters, and identify your codes and your themes that way. So based on your level of comfort with technology, you have some options here. In this section, you'll just want to describe what it is that you're doing. So are you using a software, yes or no? If you are, what software are you using? And then what is the process that you're going through to code your data? And then here, I mentioned discrepant cases earlier. So if you have some outliers, I recommend talking about them. Specifically, I recommend talking about them in the context of the particular theme or code that they differ from, because this is going to show that you had, rigorous conversations with your participants and that there were differing opinions or feelings regarding certain topics. And then lastly, you will talk about the trustworthiness of your study. So Here, you're going to be talking about the credibility, the transferability, the dependability, the confirmability of this study. And this is really just explaining that you have confidence in the findings. They may be applicable to other contexts, and also that there's some consistency, and that these can possibly be replicated. So, based on that very detailed methodology that you've provided, someone can take this information and replicate this study. You'll also talk about how you are ensuring that the findings are derived from the participants' views and not your own as the researcher. So you may want to describe in your coding process how you made sure you were applying codes in the same way across different participants. So you probably had a code book where you had very defined criteria to apply a code. Things like that are just going to help you be consistent in your interpretation. And so that's why it's a really good idea to also keep a journal or an audit trail to remind yourself, okay, I use this code when participants said XYZ, and I used a different code if they added W. So kind of just giving yourself those clear decision rules so you can easily code consistently across everyone. And then to end, you will talk about your ethical procedures. So in each step of the process, you should have ethics in mind. How are you completing or conducting ethical data collection? How are you considering ethics in your results and in your recruitment of the participants? Another important piece to highlight here is how you're maintaining the anonymity and the confidentiality of your participants. So you may be using pseudonyms or participant IDs as opposed to participant names in the transcripts. You also may want to think about your data management. So is your data collected in a secure way, and are you keeping it in a secure place to avoid participant information kind of being out there? So here you will just talk about your ethical considerations that you've made for your study. And then once you've done all of that, you will have completed your methods chapter. So now I will open it up for a few questions. If you do have questions specific to your study, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We do offer assistance with study development, topic development, selecting a research design, analyzing the data. Really, we run the gamut on each of the chapters of the dissertation. So you can reach out to us for a free consultation, or just email us with questions, and we can work together to help answer any questions that you have. So I will hang out here for another few minutes, but thank you all so much for joining today. I hope that we see you in the next webinar, and best of luck as you're working on your papers. Again, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, I see one question regarding process coding. So it says, when we do coding, is it necessary to do process coding? So process coding is really just a technique of coding. It's not necessary that you only use process coding. It's typically used along with like another form of coding. But essentially, no matter what, when you are coding, you are doing it because you're going through and you're just trying to categorize the different excerpts of text. So explicitly, no, you do not need to do process coding, but I think that every form of coding that you do will have some sense of process coding in it, if that makes sense. And if you have questions about just the coding process, I recommend looking at Braun and Clark, thematic analysis. That article does a really good job of outlining the different steps of analyzing your qualitative data. I'll put it in the chat here. Mujadot, do you mean you want to use an instrument that was used in a pilot study? Let me know in the chat. Tell me a little bit more about the pilot study question that you have. Dorliza, we actually have some refreshers on statistical analysis on our website that may be helpful to you. Sierra, would you mind putting those in the chat? Oh, I see. If doing a pilot study is enough to accept your instrument as valid and accurate. I think it really depends on how many people you're collecting data from in that pilot study. If it's a qualitative study, though, you do not need to have a validated instrument. You just need to be able to say that you need to be able to kind of document your thought process to develop the questions. Mixed methods, okay. Is it a survey instrument? Is it a survey or an interview? Separate instruments. There are some statistical analysis that you can do to look to see if the instruments are reliable. Like you can look at Cronbach's alpha. So I think that might be the way to go, but it doesn't sound like that's related to an interview guide based on what you're saying. Dennis, if you put your email address in the chat, or if you send it to me separately, I can send you some articles. I think it really just comes from reviewing previous papers. No problem. All right, and Mujadot, if you have more questions, let us know. We can talk more detailed about your particular study. If we have more information about those particular instruments and what it is that you're working on. All right, and I've got your email address, Dennis. So I will send you some articles. But yeah, I think the best way to gain more proficiency on a particular study design is to just see what others have done. And I think the area that you want to focus on the most is what the coding process is for that particular design. Because once you've identified that it makes sense for your study, then the next step is really to understand how do you interpret the data. So I'll send you a few papers on that. All right, well, if there's no more questions, thank you all again so much for being here today, and best of luck.